This video will be covering included hardware and the installation procedures for version 4.9 and newer Brough Performance H2B kits. We highly suggest having a professional fabricator do the installation and modifications needed for you. If you are not confident in your skill set or you are not mechanically inclined, do not attempt the procedures shown in this video. You will need to have some basic knowledge, understanding, and experience using grinders, drills, porting, cutting, and power tools. As always, safety gear, including safety goggles, gloves, etc., are highly recommended during the installation process. This video is intended for educational purposes. We are not responsible for any accidental injuries, deaths, and personal or property damages that incur due to the inexperience, misuse, or improper use of tooling, or the mishandling, misuse of hardware. Your hardware kit contents may vary depending on the version or model of your kit. For any questions, please feel free to contact us directly regarding any concerns you may have at broughperformance@gmail.com. All right, first step, we're going to be doing the block preparation, axle boot clearance, and half shaft clearance. We're going to go ahead and shave a nice little canyon, about a 1/4 inch deep right in here. We're going to cut this little nub off, and we're going to cut this archway off. All right, the first one is for the axle boot clearance. We're going to start off by taking a Sharpie marker and sticking it in this hole down here. You'll notice there's a hole under the block in front of the oil pump. We're going to cut about halfway into that hole, so only about a 1/4 inch depth. You can shave a little bit more if you need to once you install your half shaft and see if your boot clears. Put your axle on the half shaft once you install it, and if your boot doesn't clear, you just shave a little more. So I went and traced a little archway. We're going to scribble on there and cut that piece down flush with the block, and this part we're going to cut about maybe a 1/2 inch above and around the bolt hole here. Watch this full video. By the time we're done cutting, all of it will make sense. We'll show you sample pieces of the parts you cut off. I don't recommend cutting with a die grinder if you don't know how to use it. But if you do, go for it. Some people use Sawzalls, some people use various things. Just wear your safety equipment, your goggles when you're cutting or doing any trimming. I sped up the video so we can get this get through this process faster. So I'm cutting this flush with the back of the block. It's a little over a 1/4 inch thick, maybe 3/8 inches thick. So we're gonna cut that flush. That's the first thing. I'm gonna cut this archway. I'll show you the pieces as soon as I'm done cutting it. You'll see how much I cut off. So I make an incision all the way across to start my cut. Keep it flush with the block. Speed up the video a little. All right, now I'm going to cut from the top diagonally down. You'll see downward. You can cut straight across in an L, but I kind of cut my cuts. I make all my cuts going downward. And then I cut about 3/4 of the way through, up and down. And then I use a chisel and a hammer and I break the remaining piece off. I just put it between the cut, incision you make, and tap it. It usually pops off, but I recommend you cutting all the way through. If your blade won't reach though, you can do it that way. All right, you'll see here I tap it and it breaks off. So as long as you cut most of the way through, it'll break off fine. That's what it looks like when you're done. I'll show another picture at the end. We're gonna clean up that archway, by the way, with the porting bit. So now we're gonna go ahead and cut into here. Use your porting bit if you can. I'm gonna cut with my die grinder in at a triangular angle first because I need to get this video done. So I'm not even touching the Sharpie. I'm cutting right outside of it. It'll make sense in a second. kind of coming in at an angle. You want to cut as little material off as possible to achieve clearance for your axle boot. Making a little incision in the top. We're going to knock this out with a chisel and a hammer. Use the porting bit if you can to do this, though. So I'm going to break this off and it'll expose the archway. If you're not careful, you can crack your block. So that's why I don't recommend using the chisel on this part. Cut all the way through if you can. Dremel tools work good for that too. So here's my carbide porting bit. I'm going to speed this up for you too so you can... I see how I'm shaping it. See the archway, I barely cut into the archway. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean the archway out. That's about where your axle boot clamp would sit when your half shaft and axle are on the motor. So I'm grinding into the oil pump here. All right, taking my time. Make sure to take your time. Don't rush anything. Take your sweet time. All right, cleaning up the arch a little bit, just the opening. So we're leaving the pan connected to the block behind this archway. There's a lot of meat left for it to seal. All right, cleaning up, deburring the little sharp edges off. So I'll show you a close-up picture of what it looks like later. All right, and I'm just grinding this down, flush with the block, cleaning it up, deburring it. Those are very useful tools, the porting bit. I think I have that's a Milwaukee, a Makita, excuse me, grinder, die grinder. Those work fantastic. Or router, excuse me. Very durable. You can pick them up at Home Depot or on eBay. You find them brand new for pretty cheap. They're about $100. So I'm deburring and cleaning up this archway. It's kind of sloppy because I'm just doing this for demo purposes. This is a spare block we have. Got to make sure you make enough clearance for the half shaft. You don't want to do this while the motor and tranny's connected, though. Take it apart if you didn't make enough clearance because you don't want your chips to go inside your tranny. Here are the pieces. See about how big that is? All right, now we're gonna grind the crank side, the crank pin. We're gonna cut this little crank pin off. It's a guidance timing dowel for the crank and the flywheel, but you don't need it on a B-series flywheel. So I use my little die grinder and I grind it flat and flush with the crank. So that little teeny nub, I'm gonna grind it off. Take your time. Don't grind the crank. If you can keep from touching the crank itself, don't. If you have a dowel puller, you can pull that little thing out too. A lot of machine shops have them. So you can actually go to a machine shop and have them pull it out. It's the same way they pull the dowels out of a flywheel when they resurface it. We're gonna cut that little nub off on the top right here, top of your block on the bell housing side. You can see that. It's usually right below your temperature sensors on your head. Right. So you just need to grind it down flush with the mating surface of the block, between the block and the transmission. So you only have to grind about maybe 1/3 of an inch out of it. It just interferes with your transmission if you don't grind it. You can't put your tranny on, so it's an important step. Okay, this is the rear starter bolt installation. You have a nut, washer, bracket, nut, lock washer, and starter bolt in that order. I'm going to go ahead and take the starter off for demonstration purposes only. Normally you would leave your starter in there since you drilled, with the starter tightened to the transmission, you drilled a hole, 1/2 inch hole through the bottom starter hole. Go ahead and slip your socket head bolt through the starter transmission into the engine until it pops out the other side. Next, you're going to take your 1/2 inch nut, put it on your lower starter bolt from the back side of the transmission engine. Use your socket head and ratchet. All right, 19 millimeter or 3/4 inch wrench. Hand tighten the bottom starter bolt and then use the wrench to actually tighten the nut itself to the back to the correct torque specifications. About 40 foot-pounds of torque is perfect. Do not tighten it with the ratchet side because you could strip the socket head bolt. Next, we're going to do the frontal bracket and bolt preparation. See, these are the two top transmission holes. You're going to look for that front transmission bolt hole on your B-Series tranny that would go through normally right about there. This is your front tranny bracket and coupling nut. Go ahead and use the supplied 5/8 inch bolt to hand tighten it in. Once you get it hand tightened in, remember you have to thread that third bolt hole on the transmission. All right, put your coupling nut up against the transmission. You'll see that a part of the transmission is in the way. You got to put a bolt through there. So you're gonna have to shave the front of the transmission off of the motor. Do not do this on the motor. All right, gonna take a Sharpie marker and you're gonna mark right here and right here. All right, go ahead and shave this down about 1/4 inch, should be good. All right, here's where I have the tranny propped up. I have it on a milk crate, so it's suspended in the air. You can do it on a wooden block or whatever you need to do. With the bell housing side facing down, I go ahead and push the clutch fork inside the transmission, and I take my Dremel tool or router, whatever you're going to use. I'm gonna speed this up 300 or 400 times, so this won't take long. Third 400%, I meant. I'm sorry. All right, you see where I cut the notch down? See how I cut it in there? You can go ahead and trim a little bit more than that. That'll work, but that one's kind of tight. I usually trim a little bit deeper. And that's how it should look. Make sure you do that off of the engine. Okay, here, remember that hole going through the front of the motor? There usually is a dowel pin there. We're going to go ahead and drill through the dowel pin hole. Make sure you drill straight into the hole. I sped the video up a little so we can get this over with. All right. So you're going to go all the way through. I drill a pilot hole in the dead center if you can first. Make sure your clutch is not on the engine. But if it is, you can cover it up with a rag or something so you don't get chips in there. So your socket head bolt should go through the front, the 1/2 inch socket head bolt. So I went through, and make sure it clears through the back. Make sure you drill as straight as possible into that hole. You're going to take your front bracket, your coupling nut, and your 5/8 inch supply bolt. Go ahead and hand tighten the bolt onto the bracket. Just hand tight. It needs to be able to spin a little bit. Take your coupling nut, put it up against the transmission between the bracket and the transmission, the engine. Take your socket head bolt and drive it through. Now it should be able to press through without hanging up on anything. If it hangs up on something, you need to clean that hole out, ream it out a little bit bigger. This is a very important step. Back your bolt out halfway, right? Once you get it to slide in easy, back it out halfway. Then you're going to tighten your 5/8 inch bolt to the transmission to 40 foot-pounds, all right? Now press this back through. You shouldn't have to drive it through like that. I'm just doing it for demonstration purposes, but you should be able to press it through. Sometimes a little trick to get over the clutch fork is to press the clutch fork forward. So make sure that's all the way through. You're going to take your big supplied 5/8 inch nut and put it over the socket head bolt on the other side, on the motor side, right? Put your washer there, on there, and now screw the 1/2 inch nut onto the socket head bolt. All right. Use your ratchet and socket head socket with your wrench on the other side. Hand tighten it with the socket head socket, but actually tighten it down to 40 foot-pounds with the wrench side. Very important that you do that so you don't strip the socket head socket. See, I tightened it with the wrench, not with the ratchet. And this is what it should look like when it's finished and assembled. The transmission will be closed completely. Upper transmission bracket installation. Here's your upper transmission bracket. You're going to go ahead and place it on top of your transmission with your back starter bolt through the starter and your front one tight, nice and tight. Hand tighten the top supplied two, should be 17 millimeter Honda style bolts. Okay, hand tighten your 5/8 inch bolts when washers, supply washers. Just hand tight, just barely tight. Now go ahead and hand tighten these down evenly back and forth until you can get this bracket to sit up against the engine. All right, just hand tight. Make it rest against the engine. All right. These will be 45 foot-pounds of torque, all of them. Now go ahead and torque down your 5/8 inch bolts. All right, 45 foot-pounds of torque. Use a torque wrench. I'm doing it by hand, but I'm an experienced mechanic. Make sure you use a torque wrench, okay? Then you're gonna go ahead and torque down your upper bolts again to 45 foot-pounds. Make sure you check those. Get them nice and snug. Now double check and see if the washers spin. You don't want the washers to spin. If they spin, that means that your bracket's on crooked or not on. The gap between here and the back of the head should be completely closed. We're going to install the front lower transmission bracket, this thing right here. We have a V5 bracket. It's extended and a little longer. This is a V4. See this skinnier side archway right here? That notch faces towards your transmission. All right, screw in your socket head bolt, just hand tight. All right, then you're gonna take your lower transmission bolt, screw it in hand tight. With the middle bolt, the pivoting bolt loose. All right, we're gonna tighten the lower transmission bolt down to 40 foot-pounds of torque with a torque wrench. We're gonna tighten the upper socket head bolt down to the same torque specifications, 40 foot-pounds. We get 2 wrenches and tighten the middle pivoting bolt nice and tight. Once they're conjoined, the bracket is holding the transmission. Now we're installing the slave cylinder anglers. This is your OEM slave cylinder. These are your angler brackets, right? With the hardware, 2 bolts, 2 nuts, 2 anglers. All right, see how I got it positioned with the taper? Will make sense in a second. You're gonna install the fat tapered side against the engine. Okay, skinny tapered side towards the tranny. on the one that goes against the transmission. See how that looks? Now watch this. Bam. The outer one, the fat taper side, goes towards the tranny. Skinny taper side goes towards the engine. All right, you go ahead and screw that in by hand. And this will kick the slave cylinder outward on the engine side, inward on the tranny side, and make the slave cylinder piston arm right there, rod, point straight at the clutch fork. So you go ahead and pop. You want it angled so it's straight into it. And what you do is you press your slave cylinder arm into the slave and pop it around and onto the clutch fork. Tighten it down nice and tight. This is what it will look like when it's finished. See how it's angled out away from the motor? That's how you want it installed. Now we're going to do the half shaft adapter installation. This is the back of your motor with the transmission connected. This is your pre-assembled half shaft adapter bracket. See how there's blue tape on it? Should come with blue tape. Do not remove that blue tape until you're ready to install this part. Okay, here's your half shaft. Notice the leg that's cut off right here faces towards the transmission. You snap that off about halfway down the length of that little leg, just like this. You want to cut it so it makes clearance for your oil pressure switch. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the tape. You'll notice there are two thick washers between the tape and the bracket. These two thick washers go up against the motor between the plate and the motor. This is very important that you install it this way. Put them between the plate and the motor, not on the outside of the plate, but between the plate and the motor. Very critical. Okay. They space the plate away from the motor just enough for the carriage bolts to not rest against the oil galleys. That hole and that hole is where you're going to screw it into. See how I'm putting it on? And make sure you leave the carriage bolts assembled in there. Get them nice and hand tight. Okay, now we're going to take the carriage bolt hardware off. It's a nut, a split lock washer, and a thick washer. We're going to remove those. Make sure your transmission is in neutral when you attempt this step. Take your half shaft with the dust boot removed. You just tap it off with a hammer. Notice there's no dust boot on the right side over there. Okay. Go ahead and tap it in there if you have to. All right. Make sure there's clearance between where you cut the nub off your motor for the half shaft. If there isn't, you have to take the transmission off and clean up the material. Don't do it with the transmission on the car. You'll get chips in your transmission. So I'm going to tighten that upper left bolt after folding the half shaft onto the half shaft bracket. And I'm going to tighten this lower right bolt down with the wrench. Can't get a ratchet in between there. So get a wrench in there. 14 millimeter wrench or 17. Nice and tight. All right, so now the half shaft plate is bolted tight to the motor. We're going to take our thick washer, then our split lock washer, then our nut, and put them on the carriage bolts. All right, thick washer, split lock washer, nut. That's the order. Screw them on hand tight. Once again, if you didn't have enough clearance on your half shaft, it runs into the motor where you cut that little I-way knuckle off. Take the transmission off the motor and trim it more. Do not trim it with the transmission on the car, or you will get metal chips inside your transmission, even if you put a rag in there or something. All right, hand tight. So see how I can't spin it? You want to be able to spin this freely. All right, if it doesn't spin freely, it's not good. Sometimes if you have an LSD, it won't spin freely, but you can move this up and down a little bit with the carriage bolts loose until it spins freely. Wiggle it up and down. You want it to spin freely and tighten it in the place where that half shaft spins freely. Once again, if you have an LSD, it might be kind of difficult to spin it. You can put an axle on and try it. All right, see that archway? That's the archway we made for the half shaft, excuse me, the axle boot and clamp. We're going to put an axle on and test it. See, this is a GSR axle. Gonna pop it in there. Bam. This should spin freely. All right. Make sure it's not in gear, so I made sure it's in neutral. See how it spins freely? If it doesn't spin freely, loosen the carriage bolts a little, wiggle it up and down so it spins freely and tighten it. See, this boot needs to clear the back of your engine, and that little nub on your boot clamp needs to clear where the oil pump is. Spin it around. If it doesn't clear, take the axle back off. Mine spins freely and it clears. Rear T-bracket and transmission tab installation. Right here we have a nut, washer, T-bracket tab, washer, nut, socket head bolt, and a split lock washer. Split lock washer goes on the starter side. With the transmission tab, see this? There's a slot in there. The slot goes up against the transmission bracket, right? There's a nut that you bolt down on that starter bolt. The nut goes first. Tighten that down to about 40 or 50 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so that the starter bolt's tight. You're going to put your, make sure this T-bracket is loose. Make sure those two lower bolts are loose. You don't want them tight for this installation process. So the T-bracket has to be loose to do this. Take your tab, place it on the bolt against the nut. Take your second nut and screw the nut down onto the tab. Right, hand tight. And the slotted side, see how the slotted side, I got it laying against the nut on the T-bracket. There should be a gap between here, right in there. These two, right there, down in there. These two supplied washers are to fill that gap. Sometimes there's a gap, sometimes there's no gap, sometimes there's a little one. Use however many washers you need to fill that void in, right? So I'm gonna place that between there, and then I'm gonna take a bolt, a Honda bolt, right, and put it in that slot. You need to supply your own bolt. It needs to be long enough to seat all the way at the base of the nut on the other side of the nut. So you don't want it too short and you don't want it too long. You don't want it long enough where it comes out of the nut side, other side of the nut. Go ahead and tighten that down. Bam. Should be about an inch long bolt. Then you're going to tighten this rear starter bolt, second nut down against the tab. Get that nice and tight. Tighten that and tighten that. Now you come and tighten this one and this one. 19 millimeter Honda bolts. All right, tighten that down. Whatever Honda torque specifications are. Tighten that. Tighten that. Nice and snug. Tight, tight, then tight, tight. Post-mount bracket installation. Here you have an EGH post-mount, an EFF post-mount. See how it's 2 holes instead of 3, right? Now, these are the V5 brackets. They're 3 holes, but the locations, hole locations are a little different. I'll explain what they mean. I'll explain what they do in a second. So you notice I have some orange paint and some blue paint on there. The blue paint is the F series biased side of the slot. And the orange side, so that's towards the F side. The right side of the slots are the H side. All right. Here we have an H motor and an F motor. The difference is there's 1, 2, 3 bolt holes and 1, 2. 3 bolt holes on the H, 2 bolt holes on the F. 1, 2 for the F. 1, 2, 3 for the H. Now, older F22s have 3 holes. It's kind of confusing, but you're only going to use the rear 2 and still make the bias. So 1, 2, 3 on the H motor. And if I hold this up to the F motor, 1, 2. Now, that's the 4.9 and down kits. The version 5 kit has 3 holes. 2 are slotted. See that? The 2, that's the lower one. These 2 upper ones are slotted. The left side of the hole is the F series bias. The right side of the hole is the H series bias. I'll explain it in 1 second. There's 3 holes. You're only going to use 1 and 2. And now you use this rear above the water pump hole. Same with the F. 1, 2, and you use the rear right above the water pump hole. Okay? So for v4.9 and down, you put your 3 bolts in with your lock washers, the supply bolts. Screw them down. Now, you do the same, right? But these slotted holes, you're going to shift the mount to sit a certain way. I'll show you in 1 second. So the H motor, you can see how it pivots. You're going to use the orange side, basically, the right side of the hole. On the F, you're going to use the left side bias. So watch. You can swing it. Blue side, left side, that's F. All right, you can rock it. You'll see when I put it together, it'll all make sense. Okay, first we're going to install it on the F. Take your bracket, right? Remember, left side of the hole is the F bias. Right side is the H bias. Take your long supply bolt, put it through the back. Comes with 2 nuts. They're spacers, right? 3/8 inch nuts, I believe. 1/2 inch nuts. You're going to put them on the back side of the mount bracket like this. So bolt through the mount, then the 2 nuts. And that's going to go in the starter hole. I mean the, water pump above the water pump bolt hole. Hand tight. Just a little, not too much. Let it go. Get your lower and upper bolt. Put the lower bolt in first. Now you see when I put the lower bolt in the F, it already goes towards the blue side. If you look on the upper hole, now that motor hole's on the blue side. See that? We're going to put the bolt in there, and we're going to hand tighten it down so that the mount sits flush against the mating surface. Now you'll see I'll be able to pivot this back and forth. See, I can rock it. You want to rock it so that the bolt is on the blue side, the left side. Push it back, right? And now the bolt will sit against the blue side. Push it back and tighten it on that side, on the F motor. Tighten the lower one first. Tighten the upper one. About 40 foot-pounds of torque. I use a little drop of Loctite at the very end of the thread sometimes to keep these from backing out. They have lock washers, but some people's motors, sometimes they try to back out. Periodically, every 5 or 10,000 miles, I'll check them and make sure they're tight. You can do them however you want. Now, once you have the 2 front ones tightened, you tighten the back one. Remember, rock it back for an F so that the bolts are on the blue side, which is the left side. All right. Same with the H, same process. Take your long bolt, pop it through, put your 2 spacer nuts on there. Bam, bam. In the hole right above the water pump. Just a couple turns, hand tight. Don't tighten it down. Take your, it's critical that you tighten these down so that the mount is against the mating surface first. Then you tighten the rear, or you'll have the mount kind of cocked and you can pop the threads on your block. Okay. Tighten this down with the bolts biased to the rear part. Yeah, you're going to slide it forward and put the bolts on the H side, which is the orange side, the rear of the slot. So you tighten the lower one first, the top one, then the rear one, after the mount is sitting flush. Right? See? Now they're shifted, the mount's shifted, so that I'm on the orange side, not the blue side. Blue side's F, right? Right. Rotating it towards you, towards the front of the motor would be the H side.